Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to remove the headset. The voice wasn't loud, but it carried the kind of authority that made nearby conversations die mid-sentence. She didn't turn right away. Her gaze stayed fixed on the window, where the sky stretched endlessly blue, calm, untouched, as if nothing complicated could ever exist up there. I'm allowed to wear it, she said quietly, her tone steady, almost too calm for the tension pressing in around her. A man in a dark uniform shifted beside her seat, his badge catching a sliver of sunlight. Not during this phase of flight, and not with that equipment. There was a pause, the kind that hangs heavier than words. A few rows back, someone leaned forward just enough to watch. Across the aisle, a woman pulled her phone closer, pretending not to record. The young woman in seat 13F finally turned her head. Her expression wasn't defiant. It wasn't afraid. It was controlled, measured, like she had learned, somewhere along the way, that reacting emotionally only gave people exactly what they expected from someone like her. It's just a headset, she replied. No, the man said, softer now but sharper. It's not. Outside the window, something shifted in the sky. At first, it was just movement. Small, distant, almost easy to ignore, but then shapes began to form, sleek, fast, unmistakable, and suddenly the calm blue didn't feel so empty anymore. Before this story goes any further, take a second to subscribe because stories like this deserve to be heard. The engines hummed steadily beneath everything, but inside that row, inside that moment, something had already begun to fracture. The question wasn't whether it would break. The question was, who would be standing when it did? The cabin had settled into that quiet rhythm unique to high-altitude flight, where conversation softened and time seemed to stretch into something slower, almost unreal. Seat 13F wasn't special. It was just another window seat, halfway down the plane, where sunlight hit at the right angle and turned everything a little warmer than it actually felt. She had chosen it for that reason. Not because she needed the view, but because it gave her space. One side open to the sky, one side closed off from people. The headset rested comfortably over her ears, the microphone positioned just close enough to catch her voice if she needed it, though she hadn't spoken into it since boarding. To anyone else, it looked unusual, maybe even out of place. But to her, it was familiar, grounding, the kind of thing you wear when you've learned to listen more than you speak. The man standing beside her didn't see it that way. To him, it was a disruption. Something that didn't fit the pattern of what he expected to see on a routine domestic flight. He had noticed her earlier, noticed how still she was, how she didn't fidget or scroll or check the time like everyone else. People like him were trained to notice things like that. Patterns, deviations. I need you to comply, he said again, this time louder, drawing more attention than before. She could feel the shift around her, the subtle tightening of awareness from passengers who had been content to mind their own business just seconds ago. Now they were watching, judging, waiting. Her fingers rested lightly on the armrest, unmoving. She wasn't ignoring him. She was choosing her response carefully, the way someone does when they understand that a single wrong word can change everything. What exactly is the issue? She asked, her voice even. The man hesitated for a fraction of a second. Not because he didn't have an answer, but because the question itself disrupted the script he was used to. People usually complied, or argued emotionally. They didn't ask calmly, directly, forcing him to justify something that, until now, had felt automatic. The issue, he said finally, is that we have protocols, and right now, you're not following them. She nodded slightly, as if acknowledging the statement without agreeing to it. Then explain the protocol. That was when the tension shifted from procedural to personal. It wasn't just about a headset anymore. It was about control, about authority being questioned, not loudly, not aggressively, but with a quiet precision that was harder to push back against. Across the aisle, a man in a business suit leaned back, arms crossed, watching with interest rather than concern. A younger passenger 2 rows behind whispered something under their breath, the kind of commentary people make when they think they understand a situation from the outside. But none of them really did, because none of them knew who she was or why that headset mattered. Outside, the shapes in the sky had grown clearer, 4 jets flying in perfect formation, cutting through the blue with a precision that felt almost unnatural. They weren't close enough to hear, but they were close enough to feel. The presence alone changed something in the air, even inside the sealed cabin. She noticed them before anyone else did. Not because she was looking for them, but because she understood movement like that. Understood what it meant when something so controlled appeared so suddenly. For a brief moment, her expression shifted. Not fear, not surprise, recognition. Then it was gone, replaced by the same calm composure. "Ma'am," the man said, his patience thinning, "this is your final request." She exhaled slowly, her eyes flicking once more to the window. The jets held their formation, steady and unwavering. "You're making a mistake," she said quietly. "It wasn't a threat. It wasn't even a warning in the traditional sense. It was a statement, the kind that carries weight not because of how it's said, but because of what's behind it." The man didn't see that, not yet. To him it was just resistance, just another passenger refusing to comply. But the room, if you could call a cabin at 30,000 feet a room, felt different now, charged. Like something unseen had just stepped into the equation, and no one, not even the man with the badge, fully understood what that meant yet. The first thing that changed wasn't the man's tone. It wasn't the murmurs in the cabin or the way a flight attendant hesitated at the edge of the aisle, unsure whether to step in or stay out of it. It was the silence. Not the normal passive silence of a long flight, but something sharper, more deliberate, like the space itself was waiting to see what would happen next. The young woman in seat 13F didn't move immediately. Her posture remained composed, her gaze steady, but inside something had shifted. Not panic, not even anxiety. Just a quiet calculation, the kind that comes from experience rather than instinct. She had been in situations like this before. Different setting, different stakes, but the same underlying pattern. Someone in authority making a decision based on what they thought they understood, rather than what was actually true. "I'm not refusing," she said, her voice calm but firm. "I'm asking for clarity." The man's jaw tightened slightly. "And I've given it." "No," she replied, meeting his eyes directly now. "You've given me a command. That's not the same thing." That was the moment it escalated. Not dramatically, not with raised voices or sudden movement, but with a subtle shift in power that most people in the cabin didn't consciously notice, even though they felt it. The man straightened, adjusting his stance just enough to reassert control. "Ma'am, failure to comply with crew instructions can result in serious consequences. I don't want to go down that road." She held his gaze for a second longer, then nodded once, as if acknowledging the statement without yielding to it. "Neither do I." Across the aisle, the man in the business suit leaned forward slightly now, his earlier curiosity sharpening into something closer to concern. The flight attendant took a step closer, her expression carefully neutral, but her eyes moving quickly between the two of them. The tension was no longer contained to one row. It was spreading. Outside the window, the 4 jets had adjusted their formation, tightening just slightly, their movement so precise it almost didn't seem real. A passenger a few rows ahead finally noticed them, nudging the person beside them and pointing toward the glass. A ripple of attention followed, heads turning, whispers starting to rise again. But this time, they weren't about the woman in 13 degrees Fahrenheit. Not entirely. "Sir," the flight attendant said gently, addressing the man. "Maybe we can—" "I've got it," he interrupted, not harshly but firmly enough to close the door on that suggestion. He wasn't trying to be difficult. In his mind, he was doing exactly what he was supposed to do. Maintaining order, enforcing rules, ensuring safety. But the problem with that kind of certainty is that it leaves very little room for doubt. And doubt, in situations like this, is often the only thing that prevents a mistake from becoming something bigger. The woman glanced at the window again, her eyes tracking the movement of the jets with a precision that didn't go unnoticed this time. The man followed her gaze just for a second, and something in his expression shifted, not understanding, not yet, but a flicker of awareness that this situation might not be as straightforward as it had seemed. "You see them?" she asked quietly. He hesitated. "Yes. And you know this isn't normal." That was true. Even without context, even without knowing anything about aviation beyond the basics, Anyone could tell that 4 fighter jets flying in tight formation alongside a commercial aircraft wasn't routine. It wasn't random. It meant something. The question was what? "That doesn't change the situation here," he said, though his voice had lost a fraction of its earlier certainty. "It changes everything," she replied, not louder, not more forceful, just more certain. The kind of certainty that doesn't need volume to be felt. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The cabin seemed to hold its breath, caught between two realities, one grounded in rules and procedures, the other in something larger, something not yet fully understood. Then the man made a decision. "I'm going to have to escalate this," he said. "If you don't remove the headset, I'll have no choice." She studied him for a second, not with anger, not with fear, but with something closer to disappointment. Then, slowly, she reached up, not to remove the headset, but to adjust it slightly, ensuring the microphone was positioned perfectly. A small movement, but intentional. "Go ahead," she said softly. And just like that, the line had been crossed. The word escalate didn't echo out loud, but it settled into the cabin like a pressure change you could feel in your chest before you could name it. And for the first time since the exchange began, the man with the badge hesitated just long enough for doubt to find a foothold. It wasn't obvious, not to the casual observer, but to someone watching closely. It showed in the slight shift of his weight, the way his eyes flicked once more toward the window before returning to her face, searching for something he couldn't quite define, while she remained still, composed, her hand resting lightly near the headset as if it were less an accessory and more a connection to something unseen, something steady. "You're making this more complicated than it needs to be," he said, but the edge in his voice had softened into something less certain, less absolute. And she didn't interrupt him, didn't challenge him immediately, because she understood something he didn't yet. This wasn't a moment that required volume, it required timing. The flight attendant stepped in again, this time closer, her voice gentle but firm in a different way. "Sir, maybe we can take a second." But before she could finish, a subtle chime sounded overhead, not the usual seatbelt tone, not the routine cabin alert passengers were used to ignoring, but something sharper, something that caused even the most distracted traveler to pause mid-thought. And that's when the captain's voice came through the intercom, steady, but carrying an undertone that hadn't been there before. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're currently coordinating with air traffic control regarding nearby aircraft. Please remain seated and follow crew instructions." And just like that, the context shifted again. People turned toward the windows now more openly, whispers growing into audible concern. The earlier tension between one passenger and one officer expanding into something larger, something shared. While outside, the 4 jets held their formation with an almost unnatural precision, their presence no longer just a distant detail but a focal point, a question hanging in the sky. The man with the badge cleared his throat, regaining some of his composure. "This doesn't change what I asked you to do," he said, though now it sounded more like a reminder than a command, and she met his gaze with the same calm intensity. "It changes why you asked," she replied, and that distinction landed heavier than anything she had said before. He frowned slightly, not out of anger but confusion, because somewhere in the back of his mind, something wasn't aligning anymore. The situation no longer fitting neatly into the framework he was trained to rely on, and for the first time he looked at her not as a problem to manage, but as a variable he hadn't accounted for. "Why are you so certain?" he asked, the question slipping out before he could stop it, and she didn't answer right away, her eyes drifting once more to the window, to the jets that now seemed closer, their formation tightening again in a way that wasn't aggressive but deliberate, controlled, purposeful. "Because I've seen this before," she said finally, her voice quieter now, almost reflective, and something in that tone carried a weight that made the air feel heavier, as if the story behind those words mattered more than the words themselves. Across the aisle, the man in the business suit shifted uncomfortably. his earlier curiosity replaced by a growing awareness that he was witnessing something he didn't fully understand. While a few rows back, someone lowered their phone, no longer trying to capture a moment for later, but simply watching it unfold in real time, because it felt too real, too immediate to reduce to a clip. The flight attendant glanced toward the front of the cabin, then back at the officer, her expression now more concerned than neutral. "We might need to coordinate with the cockpit," she said softly, and this time he didn't dismiss it, because even he could feel it now. The situation was no longer contained, no longer simple. He exhaled slowly, running a hand briefly along his jaw, then looked back at the woman. "If there's something I need to know, now would be the time," he said. And there it was. The shift, small but undeniable, from authority to inquiry, from certainty to openness, and she recognized it instantly, not as weakness, but as the first step toward understanding. She leaned slightly closer, not enough to invade space, but enough to lower her voice so that it didn't carry beyond the immediate row. "Those jets aren't here by coincidence," she said, and he nodded, because that much was obvious now. "Then why are they here?" he asked, and for a brief moment she considered how much to say, how much he was ready to hear, because the truth wasn't something you could just drop into a moment like this without consequence. Outside, the jets shifted again, one slightly ahead, the others adjusting in perfect synchronization, and the sunlight caught their edges just right, making them stand out against the sky in a way that was impossible to ignore. She took a breath, steadying herself not out of fear, but out of responsibility. Because once she spoke, there would be no going back to the simpler version of events they had all been living in just minutes ago. "Because someone on this plane matters more than you think," she said, and the words hung between them, not loud, not dramatic, but loaded with implication, and his eyes narrowed slightly, not in suspicion, but in concentration, trying to piece together what she meant without jumping to conclusions. "And that someone is you?" he asked, and for the first time, a faint, almost imperceptible hint of something crossed her expression. Not pride, not arrogance, but a quiet acknowledgement of a truth she didn't wear openly. "It's not about me," she said, though the way she said it suggested it wasn't entirely separate either. "It's about what happens next." And that was when the cabin lights flickered slightly, not enough to cause alarm, but enough to draw every eye upward for a split second before returning to normal. And in that brief interruption, the tension reset, sharpened, focused. The intercom clicked again, but no voice followed immediately. Just a moment of static that stretched longer than it should have. And when the captain finally spoke, there was no mistaking it this time. Something had changed. "We've been instructed to maintain current altitude and heading until further notice," he said, each word measured, careful. "We appreciate your cooperation," and the message ended there. But it didn't answer the questions it raised. The officer looked back at her, and now there was no pretense left, no script to fall back on. Just a man trying to understand a situation that had outgrown his initial assumptions. "What aren't you telling me?" he asked quietly, and she held his gaze, steady, unflinching, because this was the moment everything pivoted on, the point where the story could no longer go back to what it was before. "You're asking the wrong question," she said, her voice calm but firm. "The question isn't what I'm not telling you." She paused just long enough for the weight of the next words to settle. "It's why no one told you." And that landed harder than anything else, because it didn't just challenge his authority, it challenged the system behind it, the assumptions he had built his role on, and for a second, he didn't have an answer, not even a defensive one. Outside, the jets held steady, unwavering, as if waiting for something, and inside the cabin, every small sound, the hum of the engines, the rustle of fabric, the quiet breaths of passengers, felt amplified against the silence that followed. And in that silence, something important happened. Something easy to miss if you weren't paying attention. The officer didn't speak right away, didn't issue another command, didn't double down. He listened, really listened, and that, more than anything else, marked the true turning point of the moment. Because sometimes, the strongest thing a person in power can do isn't to assert control, but to recognize when control isn't the answer, when understanding matters more. And as the plane continued forward through the endless blue, carrying with it a cabin full of unanswered questions and shifting perspectives, one thing became clear. This wasn't just about a headset or a seat or even the jets outside the window. It was about perception, about the gap between what we assume and what is real, and how quickly that gap can close when we choose to look closer. If this moment teaches anything, it's that strength doesn't always look loud, and authority doesn't always mean being right. Sometimes the real power lies in staying calm when you're misunderstood, in holding your ground without raising your voice, and in trusting that truth, given the chance, will reveal itself. If stories like this resonate with you, take a second to subscribe, because sometimes the most important stories are the ones that remind us to see each other differently.